In the year 1865, deep within the corridors of Berlin's medical institutions, a mysterious and disturbing experiment unfolded, one that would remain shrouded in secrecy for decades. A group of patients, unknown to the outside world, was subjected to an unprecedented medical trial. The experiment, executed in the name of science, aimed to erase the very identities of those involved, treating them not as human beings but as mere subjects of a cold, calculated test. It was a harrowing chapter in medical history that has been largely forgotten, buried under the weight of time, but its implications still resonate with us today. Berlin, a city at the forefront of intellectual and scientific discovery in the 19th century, was also a place where the boundaries of ethics and morality were often blurred in the pursuit of knowledge. The rapid advancements in medical science were not without their darker sides. As doctors and researchers raced to discover new treatments, cures, and methodologies, they did so with a disregard for the humanity of those they experimented on. It was an era when the concept of informed consent, as we understand it today, was still in its infancy, or, in many cases, non-existent. People were treated as objects, to be manipulated, studied, and, if necessary, discarded for the advancement of knowledge. This particular trial in 1865 involved a number of patients who were subjected to an experiment that would strip them of their very identities. They were not just patients undergoing medical treatment, they were human beings whose personal histories, emotions, and even their names were erased in the name of scientific inquiry. For the doctors conducting the trial, these patients were faceless entities, mere vessels to test a hypothesis. But for the victims, this was a fate worse than death, being reduced to nothing more than numbers, devoid of individuality, family, and all that made them human. The trial itself remains clouded in mystery. Very little is known about the exact details of the experiment, who the patients were, why they were chosen, and what exactly was done to them. There are no surviving testimonies from the patients, as most of them were either forgotten or left with no memory of their own experiences. What is known, however, is the chilling fact that their identities were deliberately erased. Some accounts suggest that their names were replaced with numbers, others hint at psychological methods employed to make them forget their past lives, effectively creating blank slates that could be manipulated at will. One might ask, why would anyone think this was acceptable? Was it the pursuit of knowledge that justified such an atrocity? Or was it simply a reflection of the medical community's disregard for the rights and dignity of those they deemed inferior or expendable? Perhaps it was a combination of both, an era in which progress in the medical field was seen as a moral imperative, no matter the cost to those caught in its wake. The motivations behind the trial, like many other unethical experiments of the time, were rooted in the broader goals of medical science. There was a desire to understand the workings of the human mind, to decipher how identity could be manipulated or altered, and to find ways to treat certain mental illnesses. This, however, was not done with the consent of the patients, nor were the risks properly communicated to them. The patients were not volunteers, they were victims, some of whom may have been drawn from lower social classes or marginalized communities, their voices never heard in the face of medical authority. For those conducting the experiment, the patients were little more than test subjects. The concept of human dignity was often overlooked in favor of scientific curiosity. This was an era in which experimentation was often blind to the personal and emotional toll it exacted on the human spirit. To the doctors and researchers involved, their work was simply a means to an end that they believed would benefit society as a whole. But in the process, they had forgotten one of the most fundamental principles of medicine, the Hippocratic Oath, which calls for the protection of human life and the avoidance of harm. At the time, Berlin was a city that prided itself on being a center of intellectual and cultural advancement. The Prussian medical schools were world-renowned, and the city was home to some of the brightest minds in the medical field. Yet beneath this veneer of progress, there was a dark undercurrent of experimentation that blurred the line between science and cruelty. The medical community was eager to push the boundaries of knowledge, often without considering the ethical consequences of their actions. As the years passed, the details of this particular trial were lost to history. The patients, whose identities were erased, were never fully acknowledged or remembered. Their stories were swallowed by time, leaving behind only fragments of a chilling narrative. Some believe that the records of the trial were deliberately destroyed to avoid scandal, while others argue that the medical community simply didn't care enough to preserve the memories of those who had suffered. Yet, despite the passage of time, the echoes of this dark chapter in medical history linger. The trial in 1865 is a stark reminder of how easily the rights of the vulnerable can be trampled in the name of progress. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked medical experimentation and the importance of maintaining ethical standards in the pursuit of knowledge. The legacy of such trials is not one of scientific achievement but of human suffering and degradation. And as we look back on this event, we must ask ourselves, how much has really changed? In our pursuit of medical breakthroughs, are we still, in some ways, erasing the very identities of those who are most vulnerable? The mystery of the Berlin trial is not just one of historical curiosity. It is a story that raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between medicine, ethics, and human rights. As we explore the details of this experiment, we are forced to confront the darker aspects of our shared history, and in doing so, we are reminded of the fragile nature of our own humanity. In a world where science and medicine continue to evolve, we must remain vigilant, ensuring that the lessons of the past are not forgotten and that the dignity of the individual is never again sacrificed in the name of progress. In the mid-19th century, Europe was experiencing a time of extraordinary change in the field of medicine. The advances in scientific understanding, fueled by discoveries in anatomy, physiology, and pathology, were pushing the boundaries of what was previously thought possible. New medical techniques were emerging, and for the first time, doctors were starting to think in terms of medical science, relying on observation and experimentation to uncover the mysteries of the human body. But for all the progress, this was also a time when medical practices were still in their infancy, and the ethical considerations we take for granted today had not yet been fully developed. At the forefront of this revolution was Germany, and within it, the city of Berlin. Berlin, at this time, was a hub of intellectual and scientific activity. It was home to some of the most renowned medical schools and was filled with thinkers and doctors who believed that medicine had the power to not only heal the sick but to shape society itself. The Prussian medical system was progressive, and the city's hospitals and research institutions attracted some of the brightest minds in the field. Yet, despite this intellectual vibrancy, the medical profession was still deeply flawed. Medical ethics were poorly defined, and the line between scientific experimentation and human rights was often blurred. Medicine, in its early stages, was as much about trial and error as it was about genuine understanding. One of the most glaring issues during this period was the lack of regulation in medical experiments. The idea of patient consent, as we understand it today, was almost non-existent. In many cases, patients were seen more as objects for research than as individuals with rights and autonomy. It was a time when doctors often held absolute authority, and their word was law. While the scientific method was beginning to take hold, the practice of using human subjects in experiments, without their knowledge or consent, was still disturbingly common. The medical trial that would come to be associated with Berlin in 1865 was a product of this environment. At the time, there was a growing desire among medical professionals to understand the human mind and body more deeply. There were numerous theories and hypotheses about the nature of mental illness, memory, and identity, but little empirical evidence to support them. Doctors in Berlin, like many of their contemporaries across Europe, were eager to conduct experiments that would push the boundaries of medical knowledge. Unfortunately, this eagerness often led to questionable methods and a disregard for the humanity of those involved in these experiments. The experiment in Berlin was designed to probe the very essence of human identity. It was an ambitious attempt to study how malleable the human psyche could be and whether it was possible to erase or manipulate a person's identity. The doctors believed that by stripping away a person's sense of self, they could unlock the mysteries of the mind, revealing truths that had never been understood before. But what they failed to grasp, what they could not have foreseen, was that in their quest for knowledge, they were crossing a line that should never have been crossed. The patients in this trial were not volunteers. They were individuals whose circumstances or social status made them vulnerable to exploitation. Some were likely drawn from the lower echelons of society, people who had no power, no voice, and no means of defending themselves against the whims of the medical establishment. Others might have been considered mentally ill or unfit by the standards of the time, often regarded as little more than subjects to be experimented on. This lack of respect for human dignity was a hallmark of medical practices in the 19th century, and it would have far-reaching consequences for the victims of these trials. What's particularly disturbing about the trial was the way in which the patients were treated as nothing more than objects for study. They were stripped of their identities, their names replaced with numbers, and their personal histories erased. In many cases, it seems they were subjected to procedures that were not only physically invasive but also psychologically damaging. The trial's goal, after all, was not to heal or help the patients but to observe, to manipulate, and to learn at any cost. The ethical considerations that we now take for granted, such as informed consent, patient autonomy, and the protection of human dignity, simply did not exist in 1865. The concept of treating patients as partners in their own care was far beyond the scope of the medical profession at the time. But what motivated these doctors to carry out such a brutal and inhumane experiment? Part of it was undoubtedly the prevailing medical belief that scientific progress could justify almost any means. Doctors and researchers were operating in a time when medicine was still deeply experimental, and many were eager to make groundbreaking discoveries. The prevailing mindset was that if a medical breakthrough could be achieved, no matter the cost to the individual, it would be worth it in the long run. This belief, deeply ingrained in the medical community of the time, led to the idea that the ends justified the means, a mindset that would go on to fuel some of the most notorious medical experiments in history. In addition, there was an element of social and cultural thinking that shaped the medical practices of the time. The 19th century was an era of rigid social hierarchies, and the medical establishment often viewed certain classes of people, such as the poor, the mentally ill, and other marginalized groups, as less deserving of rights or protections. The prevailing social order saw these individuals as expendable, as subjects to be studied or even discarded if necessary. This mindset made it easier for doctors to justify the dehumanizing treatment of their patients. In their eyes, these individuals were not people, they were subjects of scientific inquiry, and their suffering was merely collateral damage in the pursuit of knowledge. Furthermore, the lack of oversight and regulation in medical experimentation meant that there were few checks on the actions of these doctors. There was no formal system of ethics committees or institutional review boards to oversee experiments and ensure that they were conducted responsibly. In fact, the idea of a formal medical ethics code was still a long way off, and the notion that the rights of patients should come first was not even a consideration for many in the medical community. This experiment, like so many others from the period, serves as a stark reminder of the dark side of medical progress. While the 19th century saw incredible strides in understanding the human body and mind, it also witnessed some of the most egregious violations of human dignity in the name of science. The case in Berlin is just one example of how, in the rush to understand the unknown, medical professionals were willing to sacrifice the well-being of individuals, stripping them of their humanity in the process. As we look back on this period in history, we are left with the uncomfortable reality that the medical community, for all its advancements, was often complicit in dehumanizing practices. The patients involved in these experiments were not seen as individuals with rights, hopes, and dreams. They were seen as nothing more than test subjects, their identities erased in the pursuit of knowledge. This tragic reality reminds us of the importance of ethical standards in medicine, and the need to ensure that the pursuit of progress never comes at the cost of human dignity. In 1865, Berlin was a city caught between two worlds. On one hand, it was a bustling metropolis, a hub of intellectual, artistic, and scientific achievement. On the other, it was a place where old-world traditions clashed with the dawning modern age, and where the thirst for progress could sometimes come at a horrifying cost. The city was a microcosm of the broader forces at work across Europe during the 19th century, an era of rapid change, when the Enlightenment ideals of reason, science, and progress were meeting the harsh realities of industrialization and urbanization. As Berlin evolved into a center of innovation, it became an incubator for groundbreaking medical research, much of which would shape the course of history. However, this period of rapid advancement was also marked by a dark undercurrent of unethical practices that would later be remembered as grotesque violations of human dignity. At the heart of this complex and sometimes contradictory landscape was the world of medicine. Berlin, as the capital of the Kingdom of Prussia, was home to some of the most prestigious medical institutions in Europe. The city's medical schools were considered some of the best in the world, attracting brilliant minds from across the continent. By the mid-19th century, the Prussian medical system had established itself as a leader in scientific inquiry, particularly in fields like anatomy, surgery, and pathology. The city's hospitals were among the largest in Europe, and many of them were known for their state-of-the-art facilities and innovative treatments. The rise of medical science, however, was not without its ethical complexities, and Berlin's reputation as a center for scientific advancement was accompanied by a disturbing disregard for the rights of those who were used in medical experiments. The Berlin of 1865 was a city of stark contrasts. The urban landscape was dominated by the rising smoke of factories and the clang of industry. It was a city of stark class divisions, where the wealthy lived in grand palaces and the poor struggled to survive in overcrowded slums. The Industrial Revolution was transforming the city, bringing with it both prosperity and suffering. For the working classes, life was often grim and unforgiving. Many of the patients who found themselves in the hands of Berlin's medical professionals were drawn from the lower classes. They were people with little social standing, vulnerable to the whims of those who held power over them. In a city where poverty was rampant, many of these individuals had few options when it came to their healthcare. They could not afford private physicians, and so they relied on the city's public hospitals, places where they were often seen not as individuals, but as expendable subjects for scientific experimentation. Berlin was also a city deeply invested in the pursuit of knowledge, especially in the realm of science. The intellectual climate was charged with a sense of possibility, as if the answers to the mysteries of the world were within arm's reach. The city was home to thinkers like Hermann von Helmholtz and Emile du Bois-Reymond, whose work in the fields of physiology and neurology would lay the groundwork for much of modern science. But along with these brilliant minds came a pervasive belief that the pursuit of knowledge justified nearly any means necessary, even at the expense of human rights. This mindset, which permeated many medical institutions, allowed for the experimentation on human subjects with little regard for their well-being. For many in the medical profession, the desire to unlock the mysteries of the body and the mind superseded any moral considerations about how those discoveries were achieved. In this environment of scientific fervor and social inequality, the experiment that would take place in Berlin in 1865 was not an isolated incident, but rather a reflection of a broader attitude toward medical experimentation at the time. Doctors and researchers were fascinated by the possibility of manipulating the human mind, exploring the boundaries of memory, identity, and consciousness. The desire to understand what made a person who they were, to decipher the intricacies of the human psyche, was an intellectual pursuit that gripped many of the leading figures in Berlin's medical community. However, in their quest for understanding, these individuals were often blind to the human cost of their experiments. The patients who became the subjects of this particular trial were not chosen at random. Many of them were people on the fringes of society, mentally ill individuals, the poor, or those considered unfit by the standards of the time. In a society where social hierarchies were rigid and unyielding, these individuals were often viewed as less valuable than the wealthy or the powerful. They were treated as disposable, as subjects who could be manipulated for the greater good of scientific discovery. In a sense, their lives were seen as secondary to the medical progress that the doctors hoped to achieve. These patients were not given a choice. They were not asked for their consent, nor were they informed of the potential risks they faced. Their identities, their personal histories, were not considered important. What mattered was their usefulness as research subjects, tools to further the doctor's ambitions. The experiment itself was designed to explore the nature of identity. The doctors involved believed that the human mind was a malleable thing, capable of being shaped and altered in profound ways. They theorized that by removing or altering a person's identity, they could learn more about the fundamental workings of the human psyche. This was a radical and dangerous idea, one that sought to strip away the very essence of what made these patients who they were. The details of the experiment are murky, but the core concept was clear. These patients would be reduced to their most basic, elemental selves, deprived of their memories, their names, and their sense of individuality. They would become blank slates, manipulated, and controlled by the doctors who saw them as little more than objects for study. The experiment was carried out in a medical environment that was not particularly equipped to protect the rights of the patients. The hospitals in Berlin at the time were overcrowded, with patients often treated in conditions that were far from ideal. Medical care, though advancing rapidly, was still primitive by today's standards. Treatments for many illnesses were rudimentary at best, and many of the procedures carried out were experimental in nature. The concept of informed consent was virtually non-existent, and the ethical standards that govern medical research today were not even a consideration. The patients were seen as subjects to be manipulated, not as individuals with rights or autonomy. In this atmosphere, the experiment in Berlin in 1865 unfolded, with its patients becoming mere instruments for the doctor's intellectual pursuits. Their lives were not their own. They were deprived of their identities, their very humanity stripped away in the name of scientific exploration. The doctors who conducted the trial did so with a sense of detachment, focused solely on their theories and their goals, unconcerned with the suffering they might cause. The implications of this experiment were far-reaching. It was a disturbing example of how the hunger for knowledge could cloud the moral compass of those who pursued it. It showed how easily individuals could be dehumanized in the name of science, and how social inequalities allowed for the exploitation of those with little power or voice. In Berlin, in 1865, these patients became the casualties of progress, forgotten, erased, and lost to history. And yet, their story is one that demands to be told, a dark chapter in the annals of medical history that serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the vulnerability of those who are most at risk. The patients who became subjects of the medical trial in Berlin in 1865 were not merely participants in a scientific study, they were victims. The lack of personal records, the erasure of identities, and the subsequent silence surrounding their fates have left us with only fragments of their lives. What little is known about them comes from the shadows of history, and much of it remains hidden, lost in the haze of time. These were not individuals who had volunteered for an experiment or sought out treatment at the hands of the medical professionals. Instead, they were selected, often from the vulnerable corners of society, stripped of their personal histories, and subjected to a process that sought to erase the very essence of who they were. The patients involved in this trial were likely chosen for their perceived expendability. At the time, the medical establishment in Berlin, and in much of Europe, viewed people from lower social strata with a disturbing degree of indifference. The poor, the mentally ill, and marginalized groups had little to no agency in their own healthcare. They had no voice to protest, no means to refuse participation, and, in many cases, they were seen as inferior or disposable by the medical community. This social stratification made it easier for the medical profession to justify their treatment of these individuals as mere subjects to be manipulated, rather than as full human beings with rights and dignity. Some of the patients were likely institutionalized for mental health issues, as psychiatric care during the 19th century was still rudimentary at best. The concept of mental illness was poorly understood, and those who exhibited behaviors deemed abnormal were often subjected to inhumane treatment. Institutions like the ones in Berlin were overcrowded, and those in charge often had little concern for the well-being of their patients. To the doctors conducting the trial, these individuals may have been seen as little more than blank slates, minds that could be shaped or erased for the sake of scientific exploration. The idea of consent, especially informed consent, was far beyond their consideration. These patients did not have the option to refuse. They were not asked if they wanted to participate in the experiment. Their lives and identities were controlled by others, by those in power, by those who had the privilege of deciding who would be a subject of study and who would remain in obscurity. For the patients, the erasure of their identities was a brutal, disorienting experience. The exact methods used to strip away their sense of self remain unclear, but historical accounts suggest that it was a process that left deep psychological scars. It was not just the loss of a name or a label, it was the loss of everything that made them who they were. Their past, their memories, their connections to family and community, all of it was severed. In many cases, the patients may have been subjected to hypnosis, psychological manipulation, or forced amnesia in an attempt to break their sense of self. The doctors hoped to see how these individuals would behave without the anchors of memory, family, or personal history. But what they failed to realize, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that this was no simple exercise in science. It was a violent assault on the human soul. The experience would have been profoundly alienating. Imagine being a person whose identity was entirely erased, who no longer knew where they came from or what had happened to them. The idea of self is foundational to human existence. It shapes our interactions with the world, our decisions, and our understanding of our place in society. To have that taken away would be a form of psychological torture. And yet, the patients involved in this trial were treated as though their suffering was secondary to the scientific goals of the experiment. In the eyes of the doctors, these individuals were not people. They were tools, to be molded, studied, and discarded as necessary. The patients likely found themselves in a state of disorientation and confusion. Without their memories, they would have been deprived of the basic framework that shapes a person's life. There is a certain cruelty in this, an understanding that to strip away memory is to strip away the very foundation of personhood. They may have been forced to conform to a new identity, one that was not their own, or perhaps they were subjected to isolation and treatment meant to further confuse them. Without a sense of self, they were left adrift, with no anchor to reality. This was not only an assault on their memories, but on their very ability to make sense of the world around them. There is little known about how these patients responded to their circumstances. Some may have resisted, perhaps clinging to the fragments of their identities that they could recall. Others may have been completely broken by the process, their minds permanently altered by the brutal nature of the experiment. In any case, the damage was likely irreversible. For many of the patients, this would have been an experience that they could not escape, an experience that may have haunted them for the rest of their lives. The lack of documentation on these patients only adds to the tragedy. There are no surviving diaries or letters, no personal accounts to shed light on their inner lives or give voice to their suffering. The patients have been erased, not just by the experiment, but by history itself. And this is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the trial, the utter disregard for the humanity of the individuals involved. They were not individuals with families, emotions, or stories. They were simply subjects, to be manipulated and discarded. Once the experiment was over, the doctors moved on, their records likely destroyed or locked away, and the patients were left to vanish into obscurity. It's possible that some were lost to the world entirely, their identities and experiences wiped from history in the same way their memories had been wiped from their minds. There is a certain irony in the fact that, in the process of erasing their identities, the doctors themselves left behind a legacy of silence. While the details of the trial and its patients were never fully documented, the trial itself serves as a haunting reminder of the cost of unchecked ambition. The patients' identities were erased, but the impact of their suffering has lingered long after the doctors' names have faded from history. What happened to these individuals after the trial is largely unknown. Some may have been cast aside by the medical system and abandoned to live out the rest of their lives in a state of confusion, while others may have died in obscurity. But their suffering was not without consequence. The chilling nature of the trial, and the violation of basic human rights it entailed, serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of placing scientific ambition above human dignity. The patients in Berlin in 1865 may have been forgotten by history, but their stories are important. They are a haunting testament to the dark side of medical experimentation and to the countless victims who have been erased, both literally and metaphorically, in the name of progress. In a world where scientific exploration often pushes the boundaries of ethical practice, it is vital that we remember the human cost of such discoveries. The patients of Berlin's medical trial are long gone, but their erasure serves as a warning to us all that the pursuit of knowledge should never come at the expense of humanity. Their identities were stolen, but we must not forget them. We owe it to them to ensure that the mistakes of the past are never repeated. The medical trial in Berlin in 1865 was a deeply disturbing and tragic event, one whose full details have been lost to history, but whose effects reverberated through the lives of its victims and the medical community for decades. At the heart of this trial was a profound and unsettling question. Could the human mind be manipulated, erased, or altered to such an extent that an individual's identity could be completely wiped away? This question, while revolutionary in its scope, also came with unimaginable consequences for the people who were subjected to its testing. The doctors and researchers involved in the trial, perhaps blinded by their desire for scientific discovery, took these patients, already marginalized, already vulnerable, and subjected them to an experiment so inhumane that its very premise challenges our understanding of ethics and medical responsibility. The specific details of the trial remain unclear, as much of the documentation has been lost or destroyed over the years. However, based on historical accounts and fragments of medical records that have survived, we know that the patients involved were subjected to a process designed to strip them of their personal histories, memories, and, in essence, their very identities. The goal was to explore the malleability of the human mind. How much could it be shaped, altered, or erased by external forces? What would happen to a person if their memories, emotions, and sense of self were completely removed or distorted? This trial aimed to answer these questions, but it did so at a horrific cost: the complete dehumanization of the patients involved. The method used to erase or alter the patients' identities remains shrouded in mystery. What we do know is that it involved some combination of psychological manipulation, physical alteration, and possibly even forced amnesia. In an era where psychiatric care was rudimentary at best and the concept of mental illness was poorly understood, it is not hard to imagine the kind of treatments that might have been employed. The patients may have been subjected to hypnosis, forced isolation, or even invasive procedures aimed at altering their cognitive functions. Doctors may have used a combination of drugs, psychological conditioning, and physical restraint to erase memories, modify behaviors, and strip away the sense of self that defines a person. The brutality of this approach cannot be overstated. The human mind is a deeply complex and sensitive entity, and to manipulate it in such a manner is an assault not only on the body but on the very essence of what it means to be human. Memory and identity are fundamental to our understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. To lose these things is to lose a sense of control, a sense of continuity, a sense of connection to the people and experiences that shape us. For the patients of Berlin, this loss was not just a theoretical concept, it was a lived nightmare, one that left them adrift, untethered from the very things that made them who they were. One can only imagine the psychological toll that this trial took on the patients. They were not just subjected to physical pain or discomfort, they were subjected to the violent destruction of their sense of self. The trauma they experienced would have been profound, and many may have been left in a state of confusion, terror, and despair. How could one live without the memories that anchor us to our own past? How could one function in a world where every personal connection, every relationship, every experience, had been wiped away? The isolation and fear these patients must have felt are impossible to fully comprehend, but it is clear that they were not just victims of a failed experiment, they were victims of a profound violation of their basic humanity. The doctors involved in this trial were not acting in a vacuum. They were part of a larger medical community that, in many ways, was still experimenting with the boundaries of science, with little regard for the ethical implications of their actions. This was a time when the scientific method, still in its formative stages, was often viewed as an all-encompassing justification for pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. Medical professionals were under intense pressure to make groundbreaking discoveries, to find the next great medical advancement that could change the course of history. And in the 19th century, there was a disturbing belief that the ends could justify the means. If these doctors believed they were on the verge of a monumental discovery, one that could revolutionize the understanding of the mind, then the suffering of a few patients was a small price to pay. Or so they thought. In retrospect, the trial was not only a breach of medical ethics, it was an assault on the very principles that should have guided the profession, a commitment to the dignity of human life, to the protection of the vulnerable, and to the principle of do no harm. But in the case of this experiment, harm was not only done, it was amplified in ways that would have profound and lasting consequences for those involved. The question of whether the doctors who conducted this experiment understood the full extent of the harm they were causing remains open to debate. It is possible that they were blinded by their ambition and their belief in the scientific process. They may have genuinely believed that their actions were justified in the name of progress. But that does not excuse the cruelty of their actions. One of the most chilling aspects of the trial was the dehumanization of the patients. They were reduced to mere objects for study, their identities erased in the name of science. Their personal histories, their names, their very existence were secondary to the scientific goals of the trial. In fact, the patients were often stripped of their identities entirely. Their names were replaced with numbers, and they were referred to not as human beings, but as subjects, blanks to be filled with whatever knowledge the doctors hoped to extract from them. This lack of regard for their humanity is one of the most disturbing aspects of the experiment. It is a stark reminder of how easily individuals can be dehumanized when they are viewed as nothing more than tools for scientific inquiry. In many ways, the patients were invisible, not just during the experiment, but also after it ended. The details of their lives were erased, their suffering forgotten. The records of the experiment were likely sealed or destroyed to protect the reputations of the doctors involved. But this silence only adds to the horror of the situation. These patients were never given a chance to tell their side of the story. Their pain, their trauma, was ignored, and they were abandoned by the very system that was supposed to protect them. This is a story not only of scientific malpractice but also of social and institutional neglect. The patients were treated as though they had no value, no voice, no place in the world. They were cast aside, their experiences buried under the weight of medical progress. The legacy of this trial, though, is not just about the harm done to these patients. It is also about the broader implications it has for the medical profession as a whole. The willingness of these doctors to strip away a person's identity in the name of science raises fundamental questions about the ethics of medical experimentation. How far can we go in the name of progress? What lines are we willing to cross in our pursuit of knowledge? The case of the Berlin trial forces us to confront these questions and to reflect on the cost of scientific discovery. In this case, that cost was the very essence of human dignity. This tragic event serves as a stark reminder of the importance of ethics in medical research. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the potential for harm when scientific discovery is pursued without regard for the humanity of those involved. The patients in this trial may have been forgotten by history, but their suffering should never be ignored. Their stories are a testament to the need for vigilance, for ethical accountability, and for the protection of vulnerable individuals in the name of scientific progress. We owe it to them, and to all those who have been victimized by similar experiments, to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. As the experiment in Berlin continued, its eerie and unsettling methods gradually revealed not only the profound psychological effects on the patients involved, but also the chilling impact it had on the broader medical and ethical landscape of the time. At its core, the trial was an attempt to explore the very nature of identity itself, how it could be shaped, manipulated, and erased. The patients, stripped of their memories and personal histories, were the unwitting subjects of this harrowing inquiry, and their experiences would leave a dark mark on the history of medical science. But in examining the fate of these patients, we also find ourselves confronting deeper questions about the lengths to which science can and should go in the pursuit of knowledge. The doctors and researchers involved in the trial likely believed that they were pushing the boundaries of what was known in the field of psychology and neuroscience. The idea that memory and identity could be malleable, that the mind could be reshaped through external manipulation, was an exciting and groundbreaking concept. At the time, the understanding of the human brain was rudimentary at best, and the potential for discoveries in mental health and psychological treatment was tantalizing. These doctors, driven by the ambition to achieve something monumental, likely saw their experiment as a key that could unlock the mysteries of the human mind. But in their pursuit of this knowledge, they lost sight of the very humanity of their subjects. The patients were not simply deprived of their memories, they were systematically stripped of their personhood. With each passing day, their identities were erased bit by bit, and they were rendered unrecognizable even to themselves. The emotional and psychological toll on these individuals must have been staggering. Imagine waking up one day and discovering that you have no memory of your past, that you do not know who you are, where you came from, or what you have lived through. For many, this would be an experience so disorienting and terrifying that it could drive them to madness. These patients were not given the chance to understand what was happening to them or why it was happening. They were not told that they were part of a trial, that their identities were being erased for the sake of science. They were simply subjected to a process that turned them into mere shells of their former selves, empty vessels, waiting to be filled with whatever the doctors wished. The brutality of this experiment lay not only in its physical invasiveness but in its psychological cruelty. The manipulation of memory is perhaps one of the most invasive and destructive actions a person can experience. Memory is what ties us to our sense of self, to our history, to our place in the world. To erase, that is to erase a person's very essence. The trauma caused by this experiment would have been catastrophic, with the patients enduring emotional devastation that is difficult to fully comprehend. They would have lost their ability to relate to others, their ability to make sense of their own experiences, and their ability to find meaning in their lives. In this state, they were not just disoriented, they were utterly disconnected from reality, from their own sense of existence. At the time, the doctors conducting this trial would have been well aware of the ethical implications of their actions, but it is likely that they rationalized their behavior with a deeply ingrained belief that their work was for the greater good. In the medical community of the 19th century, there was a prevailing attitude that scientific progress justified almost any action. The idea that knowledge could be achieved through experimentation, even at the expense of human lives or dignity, was a mindset that had become all too common. The prevailing belief in the supremacy of science, particularly in the fields of psychology and psychiatry, meant that ethical boundaries were often seen as secondary concerns. The victims in this trial, who had no power to speak for themselves, were rendered invisible by the very system that was supposed to protect them. The experiment also spoke to a broader societal attitude of the time, in which those who were marginalized or deemed inferior by the prevailing standards of the day were often treated as disposable. The patients in Berlin were likely drawn from the poorer classes, from those considered mentally ill or mentally unstable, and from marginalized groups who had little power to resist. In a society where the poor were seen as expendable and the mentally ill were often treated as little more than subjects of study, these individuals were especially vulnerable. Their suffering was compounded by a social system that deemed them unworthy of consideration, their humanity stripped away in the name of scientific advancement. This dehumanization was not just a product of the medical field, it was a reflection of broader cultural attitudes toward class, race, and mental illness. Throughout history, individuals who occupied the lower rungs of the social ladder or who were seen as other in some way were often excluded from the protections afforded to more privileged members of society. In the case of this experiment, the patients were treated as disposable subjects in a way that was deeply reflective of the social inequalities that existed in 19th century Berlin, and, indeed, across much of Europe at the time. The most disturbing aspect of the trial, however, was the way it exposed the darkness at the heart of the scientific community's relationship with its most vulnerable subjects. The doctors involved in this trial were not operating in a vacuum. They were part of a broader tradition of medical experimentation that had, at its core, a deep disregard for the lives and identities of those subjected to these experiments. The lack of ethical oversight, the absence of any kind of patient consent, and the blatant disregard for human dignity were all part of a larger pattern in the medical profession during this period. It was a time when the pursuit of scientific progress often overshadowed the fundamental principles of compassion, respect, and humanity. The trial in Berlin served as a tragic example of the ways in which the medical profession could be blind to its own ethical failures. The doctors may have believed that they were working toward a noble goal, that the knowledge gained from their experiment could benefit society in the long run. But in doing so, they failed to consider the very real and devastating harm they were causing to the patients involved. This was not a case of progress at any cost. It was a case of progress at the expense of innocent people. The victims of this trial were not given a choice. They were not asked if they wanted to participate, nor were they given any information about the risks they would face. They were subjected to an experience that destroyed their sense of self. And for what? For the hope of some future discovery? For the promise of a better understanding of the human mind? But the true cost of this experiment was not measured in scientific discoveries. It was measured in the lives of those whose identities were erased and whose dignity was stolen. The victims of this trial were not mere objects of study. They were human beings, with thoughts, emotions, families, and lives. Their stories were taken from them, and in their place was a chilling silence, a silence that has echoed throughout history. In examining the aftermath of the trial, we are left with a disturbing realization. These patients were never fully acknowledged. Their suffering was not recognized, their pain ignored. They were written out of the historical record, their identities obliterated in both literal and figurative terms. The medical community moved on, and the experiment was buried, its details hidden away. But the silence surrounding the trial does not erase its consequences. It is a silence that we must confront, that we must give voice to, in order to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. These patients may have been forgotten, but their suffering should never be ignored. Their lives matter, and their stories must be told. As we look back on the experiment in Berlin in 1865, we are reminded of the importance of protecting the most vulnerable among us. The victims of this trial were not simply subjects, they were human beings who were subjected to unimaginable cruelty in the name of progress. Their story is a haunting reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, of the cost of knowledge gained at the expense of human dignity. And it is a stark warning about the importance of ethical responsibility in the medical profession, a call to never forget the humanity of those who are most at risk. The aftermath of the Berlin experiment in 1865 left a deep and lasting scar not only on the individuals directly involved, but also on the medical community itself. As the trial ended and the patients faded into the shadows, the significance of what had transpired was buried under a veil of silence. The doctors involved in the experiment, having completed their work, likely moved on to other studies, their reputations and careers continuing to grow with the momentum of scientific discovery. Meanwhile, the victims of the experiment were left behind, lost in history, their suffering overshadowed by the ambitions of those who had used them as mere tools for exploration. The doctors, in their pursuit of knowledge, had operated with a sense of detachment, as if their work existed on a different plane, one where human lives and the ethical considerations of their research were secondary. But in doing so, they committed a grave breach not only of their patients' rights but also of the very ethical foundations that should guide medical practice. This event marked a pivotal moment in the history of medical ethics, though its lessons were not immediately learned. It would take decades before the field of medical ethics began to confront the kind of abuses that were prevalent in earlier periods, when scientific progress often came at the expense of human dignity. The medical community of the 19th century was a world in which innovation was prized above all else. In the rush to push the boundaries of what was known, the consequences of that innovation were often overlooked or disregarded. The desire to make groundbreaking discoveries and to carve a name for oneself in the annals of medical history drove many to push the limits of human experimentation. And it was within this environment, one that lacked the ethical oversight and protections that we take for granted today, that the experiment in Berlin unfolded. These doctors, though perhaps not malicious in their intent, had allowed their ambition to blind them to the fundamental principles of ethics, respect for life, autonomy, and the preservation of dignity. In the case of the patients involved, this neglect of ethical standards left a trail of devastation. The victims, having undergone profound psychological trauma, were left in a state of disarray. They had been robbed of their identities, their memories erased, and their sense of self shattered. But when the trial was over, there were no apologies, no reckoning with the damage done. The patients were forgotten, their lives erased just as their identities had been. They were discarded, their suffering unacknowledged by the very system that had exploited them. This absence of accountability extended beyond the experiment itself. The lack of any formal investigation into what transpired meant that no one was ever held responsible for the harm caused. The doctors involved in the trial likely faced no repercussions for their actions, their work continuing to shape the direction of medical research without the shadow of this dark chapter hanging over them. Their careers, untainted by the consequences of their actions, continued as though nothing had happened. The experiment was allowed to fade into the past, its true horror obscured by time. However, the silence surrounding this case did not mean that the event was forgotten. The broader medical community and society, over time, began to grapple with the implications of what had occurred. As the field of medical ethics began to develop, the need for regulations and oversight became increasingly clear. The trial in Berlin, while not widely known at the time, would come to symbolize the dangers of unchecked scientific experimentation and the need for stricter ethical guidelines in medical research. The legacy of the experiment, though obscured by history, began to shape the discourse on medical ethics in the decades that followed. The experience of the patients in Berlin became, in hindsight, a warning, a stark reminder of what can happen when science is pursued without regard for the dignity and autonomy of those involved. In the years that followed, efforts to establish ethical standards for medical research began to take shape. The Nuremberg Code, created after World War II in response to the horrors of Nazi medical experiments, would serve as one of the first formal declarations of the need for informed consent and the protection of human rights in research. This code, along with subsequent ethical guidelines, reflected a growing awareness of the need to prevent the kind of abuses that had occurred in Berlin. Despite the lessons learned from these dark chapters in medical history, the legacy of the Berlin experiment serves as a cautionary tale. It reminds us of the importance of always questioning the methods and motives behind scientific research, particularly when vulnerable individuals are involved. The victims of the 1865 trial may not have had the opportunity to fight back, to demand justice, or to speak out against the horrors they endured. But their story, though buried for so long, has come to represent a turning point in the evolution of medical ethics. The silence that surrounded the patients in Berlin mirrors the silence that often surrounds the victims of unethical medical experimentation. It is all too easy for those in power to disregard the suffering of the vulnerable, to treat them as mere tools for discovery rather than as human beings with rights and dignity. But as time passes, as more stories like this come to light, the world slowly begins to reckon with the consequences of these actions. The voices of the forgotten victims are finally being heard, their suffering acknowledged, and their experiences given the recognition they deserve. Ultimately, the experiment in Berlin reminds us that the pursuit of scientific knowledge must always be tempered by a deep respect for human rights and the principles of ethical conduct. No breakthrough, no matter how significant, should come at the expense of the very people science is meant to serve. The patients in Berlin were casualties of an age of medical experimentation that lacked the protections we now consider fundamental. But their suffering serves as a powerful reminder that progress must never come at the cost of human dignity. In examining this dark chapter of medical history, we also begin to understand the importance of remembering these stories, not to dwell in the darkness of the past, but to ensure that the mistakes of the past are never repeated. The lessons learned from Berlin, though slowly and painfully revealed, continue to resonate today. The ethical frameworks that now guide modern medical research exist because of the tragedies that preceded them, tragedies like the one in Berlin in 1865. And while the patients of the trial may have been forgotten for a time, their story is now part of a larger narrative, one that emphasizes the protection of the most vulnerable and the necessity of holding those in power accountable for their actions. As we look back on the events of that fateful trial, it is essential that we never forget the people who suffered. We must not allow them to fade into the silence of history once again. Their experiences should serve as a powerful call to action, urging us to uphold the highest ethical standards in all fields of scientific inquiry and to ensure that no individual is ever treated as less than human in the name of progress. As the years passed, the impact of the Berlin experiment, though not immediately felt, began to reverberate through the evolving landscape of medical and ethical considerations. While the trial itself was buried in obscurity for decades, its very existence would eventually come to symbolize the potential dangers of unchecked scientific ambition and the disregard for human dignity in the name of progress. The questions it raised, though buried for so long, are still pertinent today. How far can we go in the name of scientific discovery? What lines are we willing to cross in the pursuit of knowledge? And at what cost? The experience of the patients in Berlin, though largely forgotten, would be woven into the growing discourse about medical ethics, serving as a silent but powerful reminder of the need for oversight and accountability. The world of 19th century medicine was a vastly different place from the world we inhabit today. In that era, science was often viewed as an almost unassailable force, one that could bring solutions to humanity's greatest challenges. The concept of progress was so firmly ingrained in the public consciousness that it often justified actions that, with hindsight, seem unfathomable. The thirst for knowledge, the desire to push the boundaries of what was possible, led many doctors and researchers to treat human beings as mere subjects for experimentation, their pain and suffering seen as secondary to the potential benefits of the research. This environment, in which scientific pursuit was placed above ethical concerns, created a fertile ground for abuses of power. The doctors conducting the Berlin experiment were, undoubtedly, driven by the spirit of discovery. The idea that human memory and identity could be manipulated, remolded, in fact, was a tantalizing proposition. The psychological and neurological sciences were still in their infancy, and the possibility of uncovering the underlying mechanisms of the mind was an intellectual and professional pursuit of great prestige. But in their zeal to uncover these secrets, the doctors neglected one of the most fundamental principles of medical practice, the responsibility to do no harm. At the heart of the Berlin trial was an attempt to push the boundaries of human psychology. The researchers sought to answer questions about the malleability of identity, to understand how much of a person's sense of self could be altered or destroyed. The patients, already vulnerable and disenfranchised by the structures of society, became nothing more than experimental subjects, tools to be manipulated, analyzed, and discarded. These were not patients who voluntarily entered into an experiment. They were individuals who were coerced or forced into a trial that would strip them of their sense of self, their memories, and ultimately their humanity. The lack of consent in this experiment is perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects. Today, the concept of informed consent is considered a cornerstone of ethical medical practice. Before any medical treatment or procedure, patients must be given clear information about the risks and potential consequences, and they must be allowed to choose whether to participate. In the Berlin trial, however, this principle was completely disregarded. The patients were not given the opportunity to understand the nature of the experiment, nor were they allowed to decline participation. Their suffering was not seen as a factor to be weighed against the potential benefits of the experiment, and they were not treated as individuals with rights but as objects to be manipulated for the sake of knowledge. The notion of consent would later become one of the most important elements of medical ethics, especially in the wake of atrocities such as the Berlin experiment. After World War II, the Nuremberg Code was established to set clear guidelines for the ethical treatment of human subjects in medical research, in response to the horrific medical experiments conducted by Nazi doctors. The Nuremberg Code was a direct response to the realization that without strict ethical guidelines and oversight, the abuses of power seen in the Berlin trial could easily repeat themselves. The horrors of the Holocaust and the medical experiments conducted on prisoners of war created an imperative to create a system of checks and balances to prevent the exploitation of vulnerable individuals. But even before the atrocities of the 20th century, the patients in Berlin had been subjected to a violation of their basic rights and dignity, with no recourse or accountability. As the world of medical research advanced through the 19th and early 20th centuries, the lack of ethical standards continued to allow for similar abuses in different parts of the world. While some progress was made in terms of patient rights and protections, the legacy of the Berlin experiment, although not fully recognized at the time, cast a long shadow. In the absence of formalized ethical guidelines, the history of medical experimentation was, and remains in some cases, littered with the suffering of those who had no voice. The Berlin trial, though not one of the most widely known experiments, serves as a stark example of the dangers of experimentation conducted in a vacuum, without the constraints of ethical oversight or concern for the welfare of those involved. The memory of this experiment, however, slowly faded from public consciousness, overshadowed by more prominent cases of unethical research and medical misconduct. But in some ways, the Berlin trial is more representative of a broader, systemic issue within the scientific community of the time, the belief that science could and should break down barriers, regardless of the human cost. The patients of this trial were simply viewed as disposable, and the medical field as a whole often viewed them with a similar detachment. In the 19th century, medicine was still working to gain recognition as a legitimate and respected profession, and much of its credibility was tied to the ability to make groundbreaking discoveries that could prove their value and elevate the profession. But in the pursuit of these discoveries, ethical boundaries were frequently ignored, and the most vulnerable members of society were treated as collateral damage in the race for knowledge. The long-term effect of these abuses, especially the erasure of individual identities and the subsequent silence that followed, has been profound. The victims, many of whom were never able to speak out, were left voiceless in the wake of their suffering. But as more stories of unethical medical experimentation came to light, particularly after World War II, the need for ethical reform within the medical community became undeniable. The patients of Berlin were not alone in their treatment. They were part of a long tradition of marginalized groups being subjected to cruel experiments in the name of scientific progress. As the world moved toward a more just and ethical approach to medical research, the example set by the Berlin experiment began to stand out as a tragic cautionary tale. While it was not the most well-known case of medical abuse, its consequences were far-reaching. It highlighted the dangers of a system that places scientific ambition above the well-being of individuals and illustrated the need for safeguards to prevent the kind of exploitation seen in the experiment. In many ways, it was a precursor to the more notorious experiments that would follow in the 20th century. Today, we remember the patients of Berlin not just as nameless victims of an unethical trial, but as symbols of the need for ongoing vigilance in the protection of human rights in medical research. Their suffering, though long hidden from view, still carries valuable lessons for the modern world. As medical science continues to evolve, we must ensure that the rights and dignity of those involved in research are upheld and that no one is ever again subjected to the horrors that those in Berlin endured. The legacy of the Berlin experiment is a tragic one, but it has become a necessary part of the conversation surrounding medical ethics, offering a dark reminder of what can happen when the pursuit of knowledge is divorced from compassion and accountability. The story of the Berlin experiment of 1865 is not just a tale of scientific hubris. It is a tragedy that embodies the worst excesses of the 19th century medical establishment, a cautionary reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, unchecked by ethical constraints, can lead to unimaginable suffering. The patients involved in the trial were subjected to a horrific series of events that violated their fundamental human rights. In a time when scientific progress was held in almost divine reverence, their suffering was seen as secondary to the pursuit of knowledge. The absence of consent, the erasure of their identities, and the complete disregard for their well-being would be unimaginable in today's medical climate, but at the time, such experiments were tragically commonplace. The lack of medical and ethical oversight during this period was part of a much larger problem. In the mid-1800s, medical research was still largely in its infancy. While there were significant advancements in certain areas, the field as a whole lacked the rigorous standards that would later come to define ethical medical practice. The concept of informed consent, the idea that a patient should be fully aware of the risks and benefits of a procedure or treatment and give their explicit approval before it takes place, did not exist in the same way we understand it today. This meant that many individuals, particularly those from marginalized or disenfranchised groups, could be subjected to horrific experimentation without their knowledge or consent. This lack of consent, particularly in the case of the Berlin experiment, speaks to a larger societal attitude toward the poor, the mentally ill, and those deemed unfit. It is no coincidence that many of the patients chosen for this experiment were vulnerable individuals, people without social power, often institutionalized or living on the fringes of society. The poor were seen as expendable, the mentally ill as lesser, and those with disabilities or unconventional behaviors as subjects to be studied, rather than people with inherent dignity and rights. At a time when eugenics and social Darwinism were emerging as influential ideologies, individuals who fell outside the accepted norms were often treated with a cold indifference, their suffering disregarded in the name of scientific discovery.